Hi, welcome back to another episode of Work Comp Talk. Yes, last week we had Eric Farber come back to the podcast. It must have thrown a couple of people, especially if you've seen a ton of our episodes from the beginning. First, it was Eric hosting with me Work Comp Talk, and then Bilal came, and then all of a sudden Eric did a special appearance. But we have Bilal with us today, so don't worry.
I'm back.
We're back to normal. Thank you for joining us, Bilal, in another episode of Work Comp Talk. Thank you for following us, for sharing the podcast, most importantly, for diving in these in-depth conversations with us. If you haven't yet subscribed to any of your favorite platforms for the pod, make sure you do so now. That way you get a notification every time we upload a new episode, which is weekly. So it is a good conversation, especially for people that are going through workers' comp cases here in California, or for those who just want to get a little bit more information. There's a ton of material already on our YouTube channel. I highly recommend you guys to jump on our YouTube channel. Just type in Work Comp Talk Podcast, or you can also jump into the sponsors, which are Pacific Workers, the Lawyers for Injured Workers. But anyways, going to today's topic is going to hit home for many people. And I know I say that a lot in many of our podcast episodes, but it truly does. When we think about podcasts, I guess guest topics, what we're going to be discussing about, we dive deep into some of the forums. What are people asking out there? What are the Facebook groups talking about? What are some of the issues our own clients at Pacific Workers come about? What are some of the topics that Bilal potentially could say, you know what, this could benefit a person, an injured worker, to know? So hopefully you've followed us throughout our journey. It's been a year that we've literally been solid with Bilal. I'm super excited.
Committed.
He's committed. On top of being committed, I think what people have enjoyed, and we get a lot of comments on our social media thread, you've seen some of the comments, is the amount of information we give. The fact that you actually get to sit down and explain from the perspective of the attorney, it's a blessing in disguise. What attorney is actually going to sit there and create podcasts? Not a lot of them. And when they do, sometimes they can come off as a little cocky. Bilal is Bilal. And I think that's why we enjoy having you on the show.
Thank you. And you're right. I mean, just going through cases and working on client files, we come across a lot of circumstances that we feel this is going to happen again. And why not share our knowledge and experience with people in the general public who are listening to our podcast to give them an opportunity to get the leg up on their case, whether or not they're represented by our firm.
Yeah. So. And even if you don't have Pacific Workers as your attorney, or you have a different attorney, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, the content that's being shared here is ultimately for any injured worker here in California. So that's the cool part about it. Today's topic is interesting. We are diving into contractors, independent contractors. What are people being classified by their employer in California? And the reason we came about this topic was because recently there was a person who was kind of cheated out of his benefits due to the fact that his employer was trying to classify him as a contractor. Now, there's a huge difference. If you don't know, there's a huge difference when it comes to what your title is as an employee. What are you classified? And we're going to dive into all of that. So I think we should start with defining what a contractor is and an independent contractor. And let's just see where this conversation takes.
Sure. So in California, workers' comp is for employees. That's it. If you're not an employee, you don't get workers' comp. Employees are people who actually are W-2, meaning that they're paid a salary or hourly wage, and they have deductions for things like Social Security, federal state income tax, state disability insurance, all taken out of their paycheck. Right? And there are certain rules and regulations regarding how employers can treat employees and what benefits employees are entitled to, like things like workers' comp. If you're an independent contractor, that's different, right? You're paid based on the type of job you do. It's not based on the hours. There's no deductions for taxes or benefits or anything like that. That becomes the independent contractor's responsibility. And independent contractors are not entitled to workers' comp.
Right, because essentially you're not getting paid by a company check.
Yeah, you're not an employee, right? Yeah. You're an independent contractor. You're doing your own thing. And we think of independent contractors typically like when you hire a plumber to come to your house, right? You're not paying them an hourly wage. You're not paying them, and they're taking deductions and stuff. You're cutting them a check for the work and they're on about their business.
Yeah.
In California and other places as well, it's a hot topic because there's a lot of employers that tried to sidestep hiring people as employees, and they want to hire them as independent contractors. And they do that because they don't want to pay payroll tax. They don't want to have to get workers' comp insurance and pay the premiums for it. There's a lot more cost to having someone as an employee versus as an independent contractor. And so a lot of employers try and take shortcuts.
Right.
And
so give me an example of a company here in the Bay Area that might do something like that, if you know of any, without getting anyone in
I don't
trouble.
want to throw any companies under the bus. No, just kidding.
Really?
No, you typically see it. There's a lot of it in construction.
Okay.
And just, I don't want to name off,
Right.
Employers that we're currently litigating cases against. That's not why we're here today. But, I could look up several cases that I'm even currently working on where employees have been misclassified as independent contractors. And you see it, I think, in smaller, disorganized businesses, a lot of auto shops, construction companies that have a lot of laborers that kind of come and go that aren't there all the time and things like that. From the employer's perspective, they don't want to be bothered with dealing with the administrative stuff.
Right.
And so they usually are the ones that cut corners.
So is it easy to say, for example, let's just talk about construction. Let's just say someone just recently got a new construction project. Mm-hmm. So you're going to hire the plumber, you're going to hire the electrician, not as an employee, but as a contractor joining you in the project.
In those cases, those would probably be subcontractors. But like, let's say you're the carpentry company, right? And you're going to do the framing on the house. You're going to hire a bunch of individuals who are going to come work and frame the house. But you may not have had a project for 2 months or 2 weeks. So those people aren't just sitting on your payroll. Usually you hire them for the project.
Right.
And so instead of going through the process of ensuring that they're employees, you just say, hey, show up to the job site. I'll pay you $100 a day or whatever it is. And so a lot of times the person who's being hired as an employee doesn't know that they're being hired as an employee or independent contractor, especially if they're being hired as an independent contractor. They think they're an employee.
Right.
You're talking about a lot of people we see this happen to are, in the case of farming and stuff, they're migrant workers.
Yeah.
In construction, they're people who aren't necessarily here illegally. It doesn't matter that they're, whether or not. If someone's here illegally, you still have to pay them and treat them appropriately. You can't just take advantage of them and whatnot. But you see it a lot. A lot of people who are immigrants and such get taken advantage of in that respect.
I'm glad we kind of gave this example because, see, I took it as independent contractors. There's a whole nutshell about classifying what someone is for a company.
Yeah. And I mean, on that note, just random anecdotally, but I don't want to go off too much of a tangent. Your status here in the U.S., whether or not you're here legally or not, it doesn't matter. There's still laws. You have to be treated as if you were here legally. If you're an employee, you have certain rights. You're entitled to workers' comp. So, all that stuff is provided to you as an employee.
That's awesome.
But I think employers try to take advantage of people's situation and think, oh, well, this person's not going to find other real employment. I can kind of treat them like crap, or I can cut corners and call them an independent contractor, and they're not going to know any better. And we see that all the time, unfortunately. But so, yeah, independent contractors, because they don't get workers' comp, it creates complexity if someone gets hurt on the job. And, what's that person supposed to do? If they don't have work comp benefits, then they don't have insurance.
So you get injured, something happens, you go to your boss, it's like, joke's on you. Guess what? I hired you as a contractor or an independent contractor. Are you shit out of luck from there? What happens?
No, I mean, there's different avenues to go about things. The first thing I'll say is that example is very common. I've had cases where someone gets hurt on the job. They're being called an independent contractor. They go tell their boss that they got hurt. And then their boss goes and says, hey, well, go to the doctor, tell them it happened at home. Or, don't tell them it happened at work. And I'll make sure I pay for all your bills. I'll give you some money while you're recovering. And then sure enough, the person goes to the doctor, tells them that. And then like 2 days later, the employer fires them or tells them I'm not paying for anything and just kind of leaves them hanging out to dry.
That sucks.
If you're an independent contractor, if you don't have income, you can apply for Medi-Cal. Medi-Cal might cover it. If it turns out that you should have actually been an employee and you're getting hit with these bills, we can fight to make sure those get paid ultimately.
When you say bills, these are large amount of bills. This is not like a let's just say co-payment of $50, $150. Essentially, this could be surgeries. These could be, depending on the significance of the injury, You're talking about thousands.
Yeah, we had a guy who was he's an independent contractor, quote unquote, but he was really an employee. And so the employer had denied his case and all that stuff. And I think his hospital bills at the time were several $100,000, which is freaking him out. He's having a meltdown because he's staring at all these bills. He's getting calls from collections. He had no idea what to do. But we fight for people to make sure that if they're an independent contractor and they should be an employee, that their case gets picked up and accepted. Usually that involves a lot of discovery. We take depositions, gather documents, and ultimately we go to trial on the issue.
So what are some of the things that show, or what are some of the things that are taken into accountability when you go from your company classifying you as a contractor or an independent contractor to an employee? Like, how do you show that? Like, how does that work?
So a while ago, we used to have a test. And the test essentially was a number of factors. Mm-hmm. There was this case that was litigated in California, and ultimately the test was called the Barello Factors. And the Barello Factors were, I believe, 11 factors that would be used to determine whether or not you're an independent contractor or you're an employee. And the factors considered things like whether you have an economic interest in the business, meaning that you share in the profit of loss of the business. Did you provide your own tools, or were tools provided for you? Did you have freedom, meaning, were your hours set every day? Do you show up at 8 or do you show up when you want? And all those things are normal, right? If you're an independent contractor, if I hire a plumber for the day, I'm not going to tell the plumber, I need you at 8 a.m. and you're staying till 5 and you get a half-hour lunch break and here's your tools and this is the rate I'm going to pay you. No, the plumber says I'll be there at 9 a.m. and you say, great. And that's the end of it, right? So those factors would then be applied, none of which were more dispositive than the others, right? So ultimately a judge would look at those and say, hey, 9 out of these 11 factors are really showing that this person's an employee, not an independent contractor. So I'm going to find that they're an employee. Nice. Or maybe only 2 show that they're an employee. So the judge would say, this person's probably an independent contractor. That changed a little bit, and by a little bit, a lot, actually. There was a new California Supreme Court case. It's not that new anymore. It's a couple years old. It's called Dynamex. And this case basically changed the landscape of how you define whether or not someone is an independent contractor or an employee. And instead of having these 11 different factors, it really simplified the test.
Okay, that's a good thing, right?
Absolutely. 100% for the injured worker's benefit. And really, the test boils down to, did the employer really control you, and are what you are doing part of the core of the business?
Nice.
So you have a construction company, for example, and they have laborers, and they're all doing the same thing. Some are employees and some are independent contractors. At the end of the day, under that test, if you're asking yourself, is this laborer doing what's considered core part of the construction business, which is building stuff, houses, then absolutely this person's an employee. They're not an independent contractor.
Right.
And so this test really kind of honed in on that being, I think, the primary driver in whether or not someone's an employee or an independent contractor.
Is this the whole time where I kind of have an idea of hearing the word Dynamex?
Dynamex, yeah.
Is this when the whole Uber, DoorDash, and all that stuff was happening?
Yeah, so Dynamex came out. It was a California Supreme Court case. Then shortly after that, it was actually set into a statute. And the statute codified the test of Dynamex into law. And initially, it was just for classification for employment law purposes, wage and hour. And then as of, I think it was July of 2020, I want to say, is when it took effect for injuries on or after that date for workers' comp.
Dude, that's a huge thing. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I think it's a great service to employees, and it really helps guide us in how the courts really view employers trying to be shady and misclassify people. They're not playing games anymore, right? They're trying to be really straightforward in the process of how they're going to determine.
Because ultimately, from what you mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, which was employers, your boss, the company might want to classify you that just to save money at the end of the day.
Yeah. I've got a case right now. I'm not going to go into names, but it turns out this company has over 100 people working there. And the large majority of those are independent contractors. And it's a construction business. And, my current client was a construction worker. And they said he's an independent contractor, despite being paid on an hourly basis, despite doing what's considered core to the business, despite having
a fixed set schedule.
Exactly.
Uniform probably at this point.
Exactly. So like a lot of these employers are trying to be shady. In that particular case, the employer didn't have workers' comp insurance either, because they misrepresented to the insurance carrier that they didn't have any employees, which would then void the contract that they do have work comp insurance. So it's complicated, and it can really screw the injured worker big time. But there's ways to fight it, right? And ultimately, there's something in California called UEBTF, which is the Uninsured Employers Benefits Trust Fund. And what that entity is, it's kind of like a backstop. It's a state version of insurance, so that if you have an employer that's screwing around and is saying they don't have employees, so they're exempt from workers' comp insurance and they can't cover you, that you can still get covered by the state.
Right. So you're going to get covered regardless whether your employer had insurance or not.
Yeah. And UEBTF, they don't play around. I keep giving case examples, but I had a case, UEBTF actually filed a lien on the employer's house to get their money back.
Oh my goodness.
They'll actually go after the employer to get paid back.
So that's something that honestly I can see scaring the employee, the independent contractor. Let's just say you worked for this person, this, and again, we're giving the example of construction, but it could be anything else, right? You're working for this company, usually smaller moms and pops company, that decided to make you an independent contractor. However, you have an amazing relationship with that person. At the end of the day, that mistake that company made by classifying you that way, the unfortunate example that you, or not example, but the unfortunate circumstance that you actually ended up having an injury and it was really bad, is potentially going to get that person you like, that person that hired you, that gave you the opportunity to work, in trouble.
Yeah, and look, you have to take care of you, and I get it. On the front end, it's hard. Your friend comes to you and says, hey, come work for me. I'll pay you in cash.
Yeah.
Whether you want to report it or not, it's up to you. You're sitting there thinking, oh man, they'll pay me in cash. I don't have to pay taxes.
Yeah.
I can take advantage of this. This is great. Everything seems good. And then you get hurt.
Shit, dude, that's a complicated.
And what are you going to do though? Like, let's say you have a serious injury and you can't work. You're behind on your mortgage or your rent. You're not going to go after the case because you don't want to hurt your friend's feelings as your employer. But they weren't your friend.
What if it's family? What if it's a brother-in-law?
If they did that to you, they're not your friend.
That sucks, dude.
That's the bottom line. They should recognize that cutting corners is a disservice to you and them, and in the long run, it's going to hurt you both. It's taking an unnecessary risk just to save some money. And if they really valued you as a friend, they would do things right.
Right. I mean, that's obviously something very important to take into consideration when you're going to take an opportunity like that. Is it really going to be worth it at the end? Yeah. What if something happens,
And if you really want to mess with your friend, actually, if they're uninsured, you can sue them too, personally. So if there's actually a statute that allows for us to sue uninsured employers in superior court, and actually have a jury trial in lieu of workers' compensation. So
because they were being negligent,
yeah. And if someone's uninsured, there's a code section that actually states that there's a presumption that your injury was caused by the employer's negligence.
Hint, hint. If you're an employer, you have independent contractors. Just because you don't want to pay the workers' comp insurance, I might, because ultimately, Bilal, the workers' comp insurance is not that significantly expensive. Yes, there's a lot of other things that come into play, but it's gonna save your ass at the end and your injured worker.
And honestly, like, you need to be, if you're gonna run a business, you need to set a budget and you need to be cognizant of what your margins are. And if you can't run the business in a way that's successful with the necessary costs, like workers' comp insurance, you shouldn't be doing it.
Then don't do it. Yeah,
it's that simple. Do it somewhere else, whatever the case may be. Like, there's ways that you can be a responsible business owner. And it's the people who cut corners and they end up getting screwed. But I can tell you this, workers' comp as a system is designed to limit damages against employers and insurance companies. A jury trial in civil court is not, right? And it's going to be extremely costly.
Yeah.
Extremely costly. And look, if you're like, fine, then sue me. You good luck getting anything out of me. it's worse, right? You can do debtor's exams where we actually get a sheriff to come out and make you sit down. We ask you about your finances, and they'll literally take money from your bank accounts. We'll put a lien on your house. We'll draw whatever we can from you. So you can't screw around, right? You can't hide the ball.
Yeah, there's no playing with that.
Yeah, if it's either take your chance with the jury, which is awful, right? Juries are scary because it's a panel of your peers who are going to be incredibly sympathetic to the injured worker. And if you and an employer are going to get up there and your story is that you didn't want to pay for work comp insurance and you screwed this person out of healthcare and benefits and now they've lost their home and such, like, sorry, a jury's not going to be sympathetic for that. So you'd best be served by getting insurance and doing things right on the front end.
Now, we work for a lot of companies, or not we work, but we have a lot of companies in the Bay Area that could potentially have independent contractors, or in general, just contractors. There's a lot of staffing agencies, you know, and the reason I say this is because my mom started working for Tesla. I saw that her badge said contractor, and I'm just like, why are you a contractor? And I didn't put two and two together. Why would that happen?
So a lot of companies do this. Google, Facebook, it's really common in tech, Tesla, and even other organizations. Financially, the infrastructure to support people within the company would be far more costly than outsourcing.
Okay.
And I don't know if this is in particular to your mom's case. She may be a contractor directly for Tesla, but a lot of companies hire contractors to then staff particular parts of the business. So for example, at Google, we were talking about this earlier, right? Google has essentially like restaurants or kitchens and stuff on campus. And they actually staff those not with Google employees, but employees from a company called Bon Appetit, which is a contractor that provides that service for them. And so from Google's perspective, it's a deduction against their revenue to pay the outside contractors. It's less costly for things like benefits administration and such. It's less headaches. They pay a flat fee or rate with Bon Appetit, and Bon Appetit takes care of the HR, the payroll, the scheduling, the hiring, the firing. They do all the staffing, and Google doesn't have to deal with it.
So if they get injured in the Google, premises, is Google reliable for them, or is there Bon Appetit?
It depends. But usually it's the PEO, the Professional Employment Organization is what they're called. And you'll see it a lot where people come in, they're staffed by an outside company. It really depends on who's doing the payroll, who's doing the benefits administration, and who's actually covering that particular role for workers' comp insurance.
Needless to say, at the bottom line of all of this conversation, whether you're a contractor, independent contractor, or whether you're considered an employee, at the end of the day, there's rights and there's things you can do about it. If you got injured and you were thinking you're considered a contractor, an independent contractor, it's best to probably just seek for legal advice, a consultation. They're free. We've always said that. Just get an idea of where you're headed, because just because you're considered that may not be what it really is, and you might be entitled to benefits.
Yeah. Honestly, I would say more often than not, when someone comes in and says, oh, my boss said I'm an independent contractor, so I don't get workers' comp, it's completely wrong. They're definitely an employee. They were misclassified. And when they're misclassified, usually there's other problems, right? So, for example, in California, there's minimum wage, right? And there's also overtime laws. And someone will come in and say, oh, well, I was an independent contractor and they paid me $30 a day. And I work 7 days a week for 10 hours a day.
Fuck that.
And they were paid a flat rate, right? And so you're like, okay, well, one, the number of hours you work doesn't even meet minimum wage.
Yeah.
And two, they didn't pay you any overtime. They paid you flat rate. That means your pay stubs are wrong. And they probably didn't give you paid lunch breaks. And all of those are causes of action in employment law that we can sue for in civil court. So just because of the fact that you got injured, you found out that, well, crap, maybe for the last 3 years, I'm owed boatloads of money and penalties and attorney's fees on top of it for the way that they've been taking advantage of me, on top of the fact that I should be entitled to workers' comp benefits too.
That's some
So usually it's, usually when we see these things, there's a lot more. It's like just the tip of the iceberg.
That sucks.
Which is great though, because then it gives us an opportunity to say like, look, you're really getting screwed the last couple of years and here's what's going on and we can fix this for you.
Right. I mean, it's a difficult pill to swallow if you're an employer, or if you're involved with an employer who's a family member who's doing these type of things,
Just pay now. Do it right. Like, don't wait. Don't wait. That's the problem, is you try to cut corners and save a couple of bucks, and it's just going to be, I guarantee it's going to be a problem at some point down the road. It's especially if you're in a high risk field, you're in construction or automotive repair or whatever it is, someone's going to get hurt. They're going to find out they should have been an employee. You didn't have work comp insurance. You've been paying them under the table or whatever, not legally. And then boom, now you're really in some shit.
That's a bad scenario.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad we had this conversation. I hope it shed light into those that are in the situation where they're considered contractors, independent contractors, or whether you're trying to figure out if you're an employee, whatever it is that your employer is classifying you as. If you know someone that got injured and they pretty much believed what was told to them, saying you were not allowed to get workers' comp, this is something you might want to share with them. How long after can someone say, wait a minute, you cheated me out of the system?
Oof. I mean, there is a statute of limitations to file a workers' comp case.
Right.
So, you can't wait forever, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
And there's statute of limitations for wage and hour law as well. So, generally, wage and hour depends on what the violation is. It's usually 3 years for like overtime and stuff like that. Pay stub violations are a year. They may have extended that. I'm not quite sure.
Okay.
Workers' comp, generally you have a 1 year statute of limitations. But even then there's exceptions, right? If you reported a work injury and you're supposed to be provided with the proper paperwork and you weren't, that can actually toll the statute of limitations. So just medically and for benefits and information gathering, discovery, proving that you're an employee, it's better to act sooner than later. That way we have the information and it's fresh and we can work on it right away.
Most definitely. Well, thank you for diving into this conversation with us. We'll catch you next week. And we hope you subscribe, share this podcast, and we'll see you guys on the next Work Comp Talk episode.